The morning fog hangs thick over the sleepy coastal town, the first light of dawn barely piercing the haze. Then, without warning, a sound that chills the blood. The distant blast of war horns, the rhythmic splash of oars cutting through water. From the mist they emerge, Viking longships, their serpentine prows carving through the waves like beasts unleashed. This wasn't just a raid, it was the beginning of an era where these fierce warriors would rewrite the map of Europe, one devastating attack at a time. Today, we're uncovering 20 of the most brutal Viking assaults. You've likely never heard of battles so fierce. They sent shockwaves through kingdoms yet vanished into the shadows of history. Why do these forgotten raids matter? Because they reveal a side of the Vikings far more cunning, far more relentless than the stories of Paris or Lindisfarne could ever show. Think you know the Vikings, picture not just the broad strokes of their legendary raids, but the sheer precision of their strikes, targets chosen not at random, but with chilling strategy. Coastal monasteries, undefended trading hubs, even bustling inland cities thought safe behind their walls. None were spared when the Vikings set their sights on them. These weren't mindless barbarians, these were tacticians, opportunists who exploited every weakness, leaving rulers scrambling to respond. And while history remembers the big names, it's the lesser-known attacks that truly expose their mastery of fear and surprise. So what made these 20 raids stand out? Imagine the chaos, homes ablaze, the clash of steel, the desperate cries of those caught unprepared. Each attack carried its own signature of terror, whether it was the sheer speed of the assault, the audacity of the target, or the staggering aftermath that left regions trembling for decades. Some raids toppled kings, others drained treasuries dry. A few even sparked rebellions that changed the course of empires. By the time we're done, you'll see the Viking Age not as a series of isolated skirmishes, but as a calculated campaign that reshaped Europe, one brutal, brilliant strike at a time. Ready to step into the fog and uncover the truth? Let's begin. The city of Nantes never saw them coming. Nestled along the winding Loire River, it was a thriving hub of trade and faith, its streets alive with pilgrims and merchants gathering for the feast of St. John. But the very river that brought prosperity also carried doom. In the year 843, Viking longships appeared like ghosts on the water, their crews silent until the moment chaos erupted. This wasn't just another coastal strike. It was a daring push into the heart of Frankish territory, exposing how fragile Europe's defenses truly were. What made Nantes such a devastating target? The Franks were fractured, their kings locked in civil war, leaving cities like this one poorly guarded. The Vikings didn't just exploit weakness, they timed their attack with cruel precision. As worshippers packed the cathedral, warriors stormed the doors, cutting down the bishop at the altar. Flames swallowed homes and churches, the smoke so thick survivors claimed it blotted out the sun for days. But the real horror wasn't just the bloodshed, it was the message sent to every kingdom inland. If a city this wealthy, this sacred, could fall so easily, nowhere was safe. The raid on Nantes changed everything. No longer were Vikings just pirates lurking off the coast, they were a force capable of carving through the continent's arteries, striking where defenses were thinnest. And the Franks, they learned the hard way that rivers, once lifelines of commerce, could become highways for invasion. This single attack set the stage for decades of Viking dominance, proving that even the mightiest empires could crumble when divided. Nantes wasn't just sacked, it was a wake-up call, one that echoed across Europe's war rooms and chapels alike. The Mediterranean sun burned over Seville's whitewashed walls, its bustling markets humming with traders from 3 continents. No one expected danger from the sea, not here, not in the heart of Al-Andalus, but in the year 844, the impossible happened. 100 Viking longships, their sails stitched with patterns as foreign as the pale-skinned warriors aboard them, surged up the Guadalquivir River. The Umayyad emirs had spent centuries fortifying against land invasions, yet here came an enemy who fought like no other, striking where no defenses stood. What made Seville's fall so shocking? The Vikings had already mastered the art of river raids in Francia, but Spain was different. These were Muslim lands with unfamiliar languages, customs, and battle tactics. Yet the Norsemen adapted with terrifying speed. They breached the city's outskirts, torching olive groves and villages as warnings before descending on Seville itself. The Great Mosque, a symbol of Islamic power, became their prize, its silver ornaments looted, its courtyards trampled by boots that had marched from fjords a continent away. For weeks, the city lived under Norse rule, its people hostages to warriors who'd crossed a world to reach them. The Moors' response was swift but revealing. When Emir Abd al-Rahman II rallied his forces, he didn't just drive the Vikings back, he studied them. Watchtowers sprouted along the coast, manned by guards trained to spot the curl of a dragon-prowed ship on the horizon. Arab chronicles began calling the invaders magus sorcerers, not out of fear, but out of grudging respect for their naval mastery. The sack of Seville proved the Vikings weren't just northern marauders. They were global opportunists capable of learning, adapting, and striking anywhere the waves could carry them. And for the Islamic world, it was a brutal lesson that no empire, no matter how advanced, was immune to the age's greatest disruptors. Hamburg wasn't just another trading post, it was a symbol. A gleaming outpost of Charlemagne's vision, built to spread Christianity deep into pagan lands. But in the year 845, that vision turned to ash. Viking chieftains had been watching, studying the city's growing wealth, its wooden churches packed with silver crosses and jeweled relics. When they struck, it wasn't just for plunder, it was a statement. Flames consumed Hamburg's cathedral first, the smoke a deliberate signal to any Frankish lord daring to expand northward. What made this raid different? The Vikings didn't just sack a city, they dismantled an ideology. Monks chronicling the attack wrote of warriors laughing as they tossed holy books into bonfires, their destruction as much about terror as treasure. For Charlemagne's heirs, the loss was catastrophic. Hamburg was meant to be the anchor of a Christian empire. Now its ruins stood as proof that no decree from a distant king could shield them from the Northmen's wrath. Yet the real lesson lay deeper. The Vikings didn't target churches out of blind hatred. They understood their enemies' weaknesses. Strike the heart of their faith, and you cripple their will to fight back. The aftermath rippled far beyond the embers. Frankish rulers, once confident in their divine mandate, scrambled to rebuild defenses, but the damage was done. Viking bands now knew how easily even a fortified stronghold could fall if its protectors grew complacent. Hamburg's burning wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a blueprint, one that would inspire attacks on holy sites for decades. And for the Norse, it proved their greatest weapon wasn't just the axe, but the fear they could ignite with a single, well-timed strike. Bordeaux had stood for centuries behind its massive Roman walls, a jewel of Aquitaine where vineyards stretched to the horizon and merchant ships crowded the Garonne River. To its people, those ancient stones meant safety until the summer of 848, when the Vikings proved no wall was unbreakable if the defenders grew complacent. The raiders didn't just scale the fortifications, they exploited cracks in the region's very foundations. Aquitaine's nobles were too busy feuding to muster an army, leaving the city to face the storm alone. The siege unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. Instead of a swift raid, the Vikings dug in, cutting off supply lines and starving Bordeaux into submission. For months, they picked the city clean, not just gold and silver, but the casks of wine that fueled the region's wealth. The attack wasn't random, it was surgical. By targeting the trade networks, the raiders didn't just take loot, they crippled Aquitaine's economy for years. Rivers once flowing with barrels of wine now ran red with the stains of burned-out warehouses. What made Bordeaux's fall so symbolic? The Romans had built those walls to last forever, yet they became a trap when defenders relied on them blindly. Viking scouts had watched for weeks, noting the lax patrols, the rusty gates, the way guards clustered near taverns at dusk. The real lesson wasn't about military might, it was about adaptability. While Bordeaux clung to the past, the Vikings wrote the playbook for medieval siege warfare: isolate, infiltrate, and dismantle a city piece by piece. By the time the last ship sailed away, the message was clear. Even the grandest defenses were useless without the will to defend them. Toulouse was meant to be untouchable. Perched along the Garonne River, this Visigothic treasure had weathered centuries of invasions, its vast libraries preserving knowledge from Rome's collapse. But in the year 844, the rules of warfare changed. Viking raiders, masters of river navigation, slipped past every outpost, their shallow draft longships gliding effortlessly where no warship could follow. By the time watchmen spotted their sails, it was too late. The city's wealthy nobles had already fled, abandoning Toulouse to its fate. What followed wasn't just destruction, it was cultural erasure. The Vikings targeted scriptoriums and churches with chilling precision, burning manuscripts that held everything from ancient medical treatises to lost poetry. For scholars, the loss was incalculable. Centuries of thought turned to ash in hours. Yet the raid revealed something darker. Unlike other attackers who sought only gold, these warriors understood the true value of knowledge. By dismantling Toulouse's intellectual legacy, they didn't just loot a city, they severed its connection to the past. But the Vikings' greatest strength here also exposed their limit. Toulouse's inland position forced them to abandon ships and march overland, stretching supply lines thin. Local militias, though outmatched in battle, simply had to wait. Without their floating bases, the raiders grew vulnerable, a lesson they'd never forget. Within years, Viking bands would solve this weakness by establishing permanent riverside camps, turning temporary raids into full-scale occupations. Toulouse's suffering became a stepping stone, proving that even the deepest inland cities could fall if the attackers adapted. And adapt they did, refining tactics that would soon shake empires to their core. The true tragedy: Toulouse's elite might have saved their city. Had its nobles stood their ground instead of fleeing, their fortified walls could have repelled the exhausted raiders. But fear proved more destructive than any axe. In the end, the Vikings didn't just exploit a river, they exploited the cowardice of those sworn to defend it. And that revelation would echo through every kingdom along Europe's waterways, where rulers now slept less soundly, wondering when, not if, the serpent prows would appear on the horizon again. The Pyrenees were meant to be nature's fortress, towering peaks and narrow passes that had shielded Pamplona for generations. But in the year 859, the impossible happened. Viking raiders, far from their ships, scaled those very mountains like wolves stalking prey. Their target wasn't just wealth, it was the king himself. Garcia Iñiguez, ruler of Navarra, awoke to the clash of steel in his own courtyard, his guards overwhelmed by warriors who'd crossed half of Europe to reach him. The audacity of the attack stunned Christendom. If Vikings could strike here, in the heart of a mountain kingdom, what sanctuary remained? What made Pamplona's fall so unprecedented? This wasn't a raid for silver or slaves. It was a calculated strike against the very idea of royal immunity. The Vikings didn't just sack the city, they kidnapped its monarch, dragging Garcia back to their camp like a trophy. The ransom demand was staggering, his weight in gold, a king's literal worth measured on a scale. For Navarra's nobles, the humiliation cut deeper than the loss of treasure. Their ruler, once a symbol of God-given authority, had been reduced to a bargaining chip. Yet the Vikings understood something Europe's kings didn't. To reign meant nothing if defenders underestimated their enemies' ingenuity. Pamplona's recovery revealed a turning point. Instead of relying on mountains, Garcia ordered new forts built along every mountain pass, turning natural choke points into death traps for future raiders. But the psychological damage lingered. Word spread from castle to marketplace. If Vikings could breach the Pyrenees, no stronghold was sacred. The attack reshaped Navarre's defenses, yes, but it also reshaped the medieval mind. Kings who once saw themselves as untouchable now slept with one eye open, knowing even crowns couldn't shield them from the Northmen's ambition, and for the Vikings. Pamplona became a legend, proof that with enough daring, even the mightiest could be brought to their knees. The riverside warehouses of Dorstad stretched for miles, their wooden piers groaning under the weight of Frankish wine, Frisian wool, and Arabian silver. This wasn't just a trading post, it was the beating heart of Northern Europe's economy, where coins from Baghdad changed hands before sunset. Yet for all its wealth, Dorstad had a fatal flaw. Its defenses were an afterthought. Merchants, not soldiers, set the rules here, and in the year 834, the Vikings arrived to collect their toll. What began as a single raid quickly became a pattern. Unlike other targets, Dorstad wasn't sacked once and abandoned. It was bled dry over decades, like a beast brought down by wolves taking turns to feed. Each summer, longships returned, their crews growing bolder. At first, they hit the docks at dawn, vanishing before noon. By the 840s, they were wintering on nearby islands, using the frozen rivers as highways to strike even in the dead of January. The Carolingian emperors sent armies, but always too late. The Vikings melted into the waterways, leaving behind smoldering warehouses and a chilling question. How do you fight an enemy who treats war like a seasonal business? The secret lay in Dorstad's very success. Its wealth came from open trade, not locked strongrooms. Viking scouts noted how goods sat exposed on piers for days, how tax collectors kept meticulous records of shipments, perfect shopping lists for raiders. Even the city's layout played into their hands. The sprawling port had no walls, just a maze of alleys ideal for quick strikes and quicker escapes, and with every attack, fewer merchants returned. By the 860s, the once bustling quays stood half empty, weeds pushing through the gaps in abandoned market stalls. But the true devastation wasn't measured in burned buildings, it was in the silent docks of cities hundreds of miles inland. Without Dorstad's trade network, Frankish silver stopped reaching the Baltic. Frisian cloth vanished from Parisian markets. The Vikings, meanwhile, adapted. Some settled along the Rhine, becoming toll collectors themselves. Others moved on to richer targets, their appetite whetted by years of easy pickings. Dorstad's slow death proved something terrifying. The Northmen weren't just raiders, they were system thinkers, capable of dismantling an economy piece by piece. And Europe's rulers, they learned too late that a trading hub without swords could become a feast without end for those who brought their own. Rowan slept soundly behind its wooden palisades, the Seine's gentle current lapping against docks stacked with grain from the Frankish heartland. To its people, the river meant life until the summer of 841, when it became their undoing. Viking scouts had studied Rowan for months, noting how its bridges funneled trade, and how those same bridges could trap a city when attackers controlled them. The raid began before dawn, longships slipping past undefended riverbanks, their crews fanning out to seize both ends of the vital crossings. Within hours, Rowan wasn't just sacked, it was transformed into a Viking stronghold, the first domino in a chain of terror that would ripple deep into Francia. What made this occupation different from earlier raids? The Norsemen didn't just take wealth, they weaponized geography. Rowan's bridges became toll gates where passing merchant ships paid in silver or blood. Its granaries, once feeding the region, now stocked Viking camps upstream. For the first time, locals watched as their conquerors didn't vanish with the tide, but instead repaired the very walls they'd broken, turning a Frankish city into a Norse fortress. The lesson was brutal. Vikings could exploit not just weaknesses in stone, but in the very networks that bound a kingdom together. The Seine Valley's nightmare had only begun. From Rowan's captured docks, Viking bands launched strikes as far as Paris, their ships gliding past towns too paralyzed to resist. Frankish chroniclers wrote of smoke staining the horizon for years, each plume marking another village stripped bare by warriors who no longer needed to return home between attacks. This wasn't just violence, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. By holding Rowan, the Vikings proved they could choke a kingdom's lifelines without ever storming its capital. Yet the true innovation lay in their logistics. Unlike earlier raiders who relied on surprise, these Norsemen built alliances with local farmers, trading protection for supplies. Some even married into Frankish families, blurring the lines between invader and resident. Rowan became a grim experiment, one that revealed how easily conquest could shift from axes to assimilation. By the time Frankish armies finally reclaimed the city decades later, the Vikings had already moved on, their tactics refined, but the blueprint remained: control the rivers and you control the fate of empires. The abbey bells of St. Lo had barely finished ringing for morning prayers when the first shouts echoed through the cloisters. By midday, the city was in ruins, its famed scriptorium aflame, its monks cut down clutching relics they'd sworn to protect. The year was 889, and this wasn't just another Viking raid. It was a meticulously planned heist, one that exposed the spine-chilling efficiency of Norse intelligence networks. How did they know to dig beneath the altar's third stone, or which monk carried the key to the reliquary? The answer lay in whispers traded in dockside taverns, in converts with divided loyalties, in scouts who'd mapped every sanctuary between Rowan and Rennes. St. Lo's destruction wasn't mindless violence, it was surgical precision disguised as chaos. For the church, the attack struck deeper than any blade. Sacred bones, once believed to shield cities through divine power, were now carted off in Viking longships like common loot. The message couldn't be clearer: not even heaven's favor could stop the Northmen. In the aftermath, bishops made a desperate gamble. If treasures couldn't be defended, they'd be scattered. Relics were split into fragments: a saint's finger bone sent to Tours, a lock of martyr's hair hidden in limoges, a splinter of the true cross smuggled into Burgundy under armed guard. This diaspora of holiness changed medieval Christianity forever. No longer would faith be anchored to single, vulnerable sites. Now, a web of smaller shrines stretched across Europe, each claiming a sliver of sanctity. Yet the Vikings adapted yet again. As relics dispersed, so did their raiding parties, smaller, nimbler bands tracking shipments with eerie persistence. A monk's diary from Metz tells of a chest of saintly remains intercepted just miles from safety, its guards outmaneuvered by riders who seemed to know every forest path. The grimmest irony: some fragments likely ended up back in Norse hands anyway, traded by Frankish nobles for the return of kidnapped kin. St. Lo's fall proved that in this war of faith versus force, knowledge was the deadliest currency, and the Vikings were its masters. What survived wasn't just the physical remnants of saints, but a hardened resolve. Monasteries began building underground crypts, their entrances hidden beneath labyrinthine cloisters. Illuminated manuscripts now depicted Vikings not as pagan brutes, but as a cunning scourge, a test from God, and in that shift lay the raid's true legacy. Europe had learned that holiness alone couldn't shield the faithful. If divine relics were to endure, they'd need earthly protectors, stone walls, bribes, and above all, silence. The Vikings had taught the age a cruel lesson sometimes: the greatest treasures are those no one knows exist. The Bishop of Théowon stood trembling in his finest robes, the gold-threaded vestments glinting in the torchlight as he raised a jeweled crucifix toward the Viking warlord. His voice, trained to echo through cathedral vaults, now quivered with desperate bargains: pardons from heaven, ransoms from earthly treasuries. the Norseman's laughter cut through his pleas like a Sikh's through silk. In that brutal moment, the rules of medieval power inverted. The year was 880, and Théowon, a city so pivotal that Charlemagne himself had rebuilt its walls, was learning a harrowing lesson. No title, no relic, no divine right could shield a target marked by Viking ambition. What made this massacre different from earlier raids? Théowon wasn't just wealthy, it was a nerve center of Frankish governance where royal decrees were copied and dispatched across the realm. Burning its scriptoriums erased laws, slaughtering its bishops severed a link in the chain of command, but the Vikings' true mastery lay in their timing. They struck as the Carolingian Empire fractured brother against brother, kings squabbling over scraps of land, leaving cities like this one to fend for themselves. The mockery before execution wasn't just cruelty, it was theater. By humiliating the bishop publicly, they sent a message to every trembling priest and petty lord watching from nearby towns: your gods cannot save you. The psychological aftershocks rippled far beyond the smoldering ruins. Flanders' coastal communities didn't just fortify, they fled inland in waves, abandoning generations of farmland to the tides. Local chronicles describe wells poisoned with corpses, roads littered with discarded sacraments, as if the very tools of faith had failed. Yet the Vikings, ever observant, noticed something their victims missed. The terror they sowed wasn't just about fear, it was about economics. Empty villages meant untaxed lands, starving royal coffers. Silent ports meant no patrols to intercept the next fleet. Théowon's destruction became a grim calculator. A single spectacular atrocity could depopulate an entire region, making future raids exponentially easier. Perhaps the most chilling detail, the attackers left one structure standing: the bishop's empty throne, perched atop the ash-strewn cathedral floor. It wasn't oversight, it was a beacon. Let returning survivors see the seat of power spared, yet impotent. Let them grasp that authority without force is just carved wood. Within months, Viking bands would exploit Flanders' paralysis, sailing up deserted rivers to strike Rheims, Amiens, even the outskirts of Paris itself. Théowon hadn't just fallen, it had become a template. Show the world its protectors are hollow, and the world collapses inward. Ghent's looms had woven fortunes into tapestries and fine cloth, its warehouses bursting with dyes from the east and wool from English pastures. By the year 851, the city was a beacon of prosperity, and that made it irresistible. Most raiders would have taken the obvious path, sailing up the Scheldt River where Frankish garrisons stood waiting. But the Vikings who came for Ghent didn't play by the rules. Under cover of darkness, they dragged their longships ashore, rolling them on logs across 2 miles of marshland to bypass every watchtower. By dawn, they were already inside the city's walls, their axes glinting amid the panic of merchants and weavers alike. What made this assault legendary wasn't just the loot, it was the logistics. Portaging ships overland required brutal coordination. Teams of warriors hauling ton after ton of oak and iron, scouts silencing any farmer who stumbled upon their path. The Franks had prepared for river attacks, not an enemy who treated their warships like sleds. Ghent's defenders, trained to guard bridges and river bends, found themselves outflanked by an adversary that literally rewrote the map. The city's wealth, once protected by geography, became its downfall when the Vikings proved geography was just another obstacle to dismantle. The economic aftermath was apocalyptic. Textile workshops, centuries of specialized knowledge passed down through guilds, burned to ash. Dye vats tipped into the canals, staining the water crimson for weeks. But the real blow came later, when merchants fled to safer cities, taking their trade networks with them. Ghent's recovery took decades, not because the Vikings took everything, but because they shattered the confidence that built it. Who would invest in a city that could be breached by warriors dragging ships through fields? This raid marked a turning point in Viking strategy. No longer constrained by waterways, they began seeing the landscape as a series of possibilities. Rivers could be circumvented, mountains could be crossed, and any city, no matter how clever its defenses, was just one innovative approach away from falling. The Franks scrambled to fortify inland routes afterward, but the lesson was clear. The Vikings weren't just raiders, they were engineers of chaos, turning the very earth beneath their enemies' feet into a weapon. Perhaps the most chilling detail, the path they carved through Ghent's marshes became a highway for future attacks not just by Vikings, but by any army savvy enough to follow their tracks. Centuries later, medieval generals still studied the raid, marveling at how a few dozen longships had rewritten the rules of warfare. Ghent's tragedy proved one enduring truth. In the hands of the desperate and determined, even the most unthinkable route becomes a road to ruin. The golden reliquary of Saint Martial had watched over Limoges for centuries, its gem-studded surface catching the light from 1,000 candles lit in devotion. Pilgrims traveled weeks to touch its surface, believing the saint's bones within could cure plagues and pardon sins. But in the summer of 864, the Vikings saw not a sacred object, just another box to crack open. When they shattered the reliquary against the cathedral floor, scattering bones like kindling, they weren't just looting a church, they were dismantling the very idea of sanctuary. Limoges' destruction wasn't measured in gold or silver. The real damage was metaphysical. For medieval Christians, relics weren't mere objects, they were living conduits to the divine, physical anchors holding back chaos. When the Vikings treated Saint Martial's remains with the same indifference as a farmer tossing chicken bones to dogs, they exposed a terrifying truth: no covenant with heaven could stop them. Local chronicles describe warriors using the saint's femur as a torch holder during their victory feast, a deliberate insult that turned sacrilege into theater. Every detail was calculated. Let the survivors see, let them remember, let them carry the horror to every pulpit in Francia. Yet from the ashes rose an unexpected weapon: storytelling. Monks who escaped the raid began crafting vivid accounts of martyrdom, not just of priests struck down at the altar, but of relics themselves, choosing destruction over defilement. One popular tale claimed the shattered reliquary wept holy oil as it fell, a sign Saint Martial had absorbed the attack's sacrilege to spare his people further suffering. These narratives transformed Limoges from a victim into a symbol, its trauma reframed as a test of faith. Soon, churches across Europe were commissioning paintings of Viking raids with a curious twist. The invaders' faces were often blurred or grotesquely distorted, while the martyred saints shone with unearthly light. The message was clear: violence could break bodies, but only faith could judge souls. The raid's afterlife was even more revealing. Limoges' bishop, rather than rebuilding the cathedral exactly as it was, constructed a new crypt deep underground, not to hide the next set of relics, but to force attackers into a bottleneck where defenders could pick them off. This wasn't just architecture, it was psychological warfare turned inward. Every step down those narrow stairs would remind future raiders they were entering a trap, not a treasury. Meanwhile, the scattered fragments of Saint Martial's bones became more revered than the whole had ever been, each splinter now a standalone relic gifted to allied churches. The Vikings had aimed to erode faith by violating its symbols instead. They multiplied them, creating a network of sacred sites where none had existed before. What began as an act of calculated desecration ended up rewriting medieval spirituality. The attack on Limoges proved that terror, no matter how brutal, could be metabolized into something unbreakable. And for the Vikings, their greatest miscalculation lay in underestimating the power of a story, one where even their most shocking acts could be spun into threads of a larger divine plan. Soon, kings would learn to fight back not just with swords, but with parchment and ink, turning Viking atrocities into fuel for the very faith they'd sought to mock. The snows came early to Angers in the year 873. freezing the main river solid, a death sentence for any city that relied on winter to keep Vikings at bay. But these weren't the hit-and-run raiders of decades past. This time they'd come to stay. Longships hauled onto the riverbank became makeshift barracks, their curved hulls turned upside down to form roofs for a sprawling camp. Watchtowers of lashed-together timber rose where Frankish market stalls once stood. Angers wasn't just sacked, it was remodeled, its streets now patrolled by warriors who sharpened axes under a conqueror's moon. What made this occupation so revolutionary? Previous Viking bands had wintered in makeshift camps, but Angers was different. They didn't just occupy the city, they weaponized its infrastructure. Stone granaries meant to feed Frankish garrisons now stocked Norse larders. The bishop's palace, with its thick walls and commanding view of the river, became a warlord's throne room. Even the city's Christian cemeteries were repurposed. Their carved crosses toppled to make space for forges where blacksmiths reforged looted silver into hack silver currency. This wasn't a raid, it was a hostile corporate takeover, with the Vikings exploiting every asset Angers' former rulers had built. The Frankish response laid bare their strategic blind spots. When King Charles the Bald finally rallied an army to besiege the city, he assumed starving the Vikings out would be simple, but the Norsemen had planned ahead. While the Franks shivered in tents outside the walls, their enemies dined on stockpiled grain and melted snow for fresh water. Worse, Viking scouts slipped past siege lines at will, using frozen tributaries the Franks hadn't thought to guard. After months of humiliating stalemate, Charles abandoned the siege, paying the invaders 7,000 pounds of silver just to leave, a ransom that only funded more raids. Angers' fall revealed a terrifying new normal. Control of the main river meant Vikings could strike deep into France's heartland whenever they pleased, bypassing fortified cities along the Loire. Local nobles, realizing royal armies couldn't protect them, began cutting their own deals with Norse warlords, paying tribute in exchange for being spared. The line between invader and neighbor blurred. Some Viking bands even offered their services as mercenaries, protecting towns from other raiders for a fee. But the lasting legacy wasn't just military. Angers became a blueprint for occupation economics. The Vikings didn't just take wealth, they monetized conquest, turning Frankish infrastructure into revenue streams. Toll bridges, repurposed churches turned into trading posts, even renting out captured farmland back to its original owners. Every aspect of daily life became a profit center. By the time spring thaw came, the message was clear. The age of smash and grab raids was over. The future belonged to those who could conquer, adapt, and exploit. And as the Franks would soon learn, the Vikings were just getting started. Tyre's ancient stones had stood unbroken since the days when Roman emperors walked its flagstone streets. By the year 882, it was a living museum, its basilicas and amphitheaters crammed with treasures hauled from across the empire. But monuments don't stop axes. When Viking scouts spotted the city's fractured defenses, they didn't see a relic of the past, they saw an opportunity dressed in marble. While Tyre's rival nobles bickered over toll rights and vineyard borders, the Northmen were already dragging their longships ashore, turning the Moselle River into an invasion route Rome's engineers never anticipated. What unfolded wasn't just another raid, it was cultural arson. Viking bands specifically targeted the Porta Nigra's shadowed archives, where crumbling scrolls held everything from Seneca's lost plays to detailed maps of imperial mines. Precious metals could be melted down, but knowledge once burned was gone forever. Local monks later wrote of warriors using priceless mosaics as backdrops for drinking games, their laughter echoing through halls built for philosophers' debates. The destruction felt personal because it was. This wasn't blind looting, it was a calculated erasure of the very symbols that made Tyre more than just another river town. Yet the real tragedy lay in how preventable it had been. unlike coastal cities, Trier lay deep inland, shielded by walls that had repelled Attila's Huns. Its downfall came from within. Two rival counts, both sworn to defend the city, had withdrawn their garrisons to settle a petty land dispute, leaving entire sections of the ramparts unmanned. Viking spies posing as fur traders had noted the gaps for weeks. When the attack came, it wasn't through brute force but through gates left carelessly unbarred, their hinges oiled by local neglect. The aftermath revealed a bitter irony. While the Vikings carted off wagonloads of loot, the nobles who'd abandoned Trier rushed to blame each other, their feud intensifying even as the city smoldered. For opportunistic Norse warlords, that division became the real prize. News spread swiftly along trade routes. Where Frankish lords squabbled, Viking fortunes could be made. Within months, bands that had never ventured beyond coastal raids were probing deeper inland, testing defenses at Metz, Verdun, even Aachen. Each attack emboldened by the realization that Europe's greatest weakness wasn't its walls, but the men who'd forgotten how to defend them. Trier's legacy wasn't just in what was lost, but in what it taught the age. The Vikings didn't invent political strife, they simply weaponized it, turning aristocratic pride into an entry point for devastation. And as the smoke cleared over the Moselle, one truth burned brighter than the flames. No artifact, no matter how ancient, was safe in a city where its guardians valued power over preservation. Orléans wasn't just a city, it was a beacon. Nestled on a bend of the Loire River, its soaring spires and bustling pilgrim hostels made it the spiritual capital of West Francia. But in the autumn of 856, that sanctity became its curse. Viking raiders, fresh from plundering Paris, turned their gaze southward. They didn't come for gold alone, they came to break the very soul of a kingdom. The attack unfolded with nightmarish precision. While most cities fell to brute force, Orléans suffered something far worse, a performance of calculated sacrilege. Monks trapped inside the Abbey of Saint Croix later wrote of warriors hurling consecrated wafers to the ground like common crumbs, of baptismal fonts filled with blood instead of holy water. But one detail seared itself into Frankish memory: the infants. By tossing the youngest victims into bonfires made from splintered pews, the Vikings transformed shock into legend. This wasn't mere violence, it was psychological warfare waged with terrifying showmanship. Why gamble on such a deep strike into Frankish territory? Orléans sat at a crossroads of faith and power. Its bishop anointed kings, its relics drew pilgrims from as far as Rome. To desecrate it was to prove no divine favor could shield even Christianity's strongest bastions. The horror stories spreading from its ruins did more damage than any army could, undermining the church's authority in lands untouched by Norse axes. Yet the raid also sparked an unexpected reversal. Where earlier attacks had left nobles paralyzed, Orléans' torment became a rallying cry. Charles the Bald, once mocked for paying Danegeld, now seized the narrative. His envoys circulated accounts of the massacre, framing resistance as a holy duty. Soon, Frankish armies began adopting Viking tactics, hitting raider camps at dawn, poisoning water supplies, even using captured longships as bait. The very brutality meant to cripple morale had birthed something dangerous, a foe learning to fight fire with fire. The deeper irony, many Vikings soon regretted the excess. War bands relying on ransom found villages emptied by terror, their usual victims fled or armed. By the 870s, some Norse leaders issued codes banning attacks on churches, not out of mercy but pragmatism. Dead pilgrims couldn't pay tribute. Orléans' ruin taught both sides a grim lesson. There's a line where terror stops profiting conquerors and starts creating martyrs. And once crossed, even the fiercest raiders might find themselves outmatched by the fury of the faithful. Béziers slept uneasily behind its watchtowers, their flickering beacon fires the only defiance against the storm-lashed Mediterranean. But on that night in 859, the weather itself betrayed the city. While guards huddled from the rain, Viking longships rode the swells like shadows, their oars muffled by thunder. By the time the alarm sounded, it was too late. The raiders were already scaling cliffs the towers couldn't see, their axes glinting in the flash of lightning. What followed wasn't just a raid, it was a lesson in how the Northmen turned nature itself into a weapon. The true horror unfolded in the churches, as panicked citizens flooded sanctuaries, trusting holy ground would shield them. The Vikings proved otherwise. Doors barricaded with pews splintered under war hammers. Altars meant for sacraments became slabs for slaughter. Yet the brutality served a darker purpose by targeting sacred spaces. The raiders didn't just take lives, they shattered the very idea of sanctuary. Survivors whispered of warriors laughing as they tossed consecrated chalices into puddles, their sacrilege as deliberate as their tactics. Rebuilding Béziers became an obsession for the fractured Frankish south. The new walls rose twice as high, their stones bonded with mortar mixed with crushed seashells for strength. Watchmen now peered not just seaward but inland, knowing the Vikings had come overland from their ships. But the real innovation was psychological. The bishop ordered every church door reinforced with iron straps, not just for defense but as visible reminders. Let the faithful see the scars and remember, yet the deepest wounds never healed. Generations later, Béziers merchants still refused to trade on stormy nights, their superstition outlasting even Viking memory. The raid's legacy wasn't just in stone, it was in the quiet terror of a people who'd learned that no wall, no matter how thick, could stop an enemy who wielded the skies and seas as allies. And for the Northmen, Béziers became proof that sometimes the greatest advantage isn't strength or speed, but the wisdom to let nature soften your target before you strike. The city's torment also exposed a flaw in Viking strategy. Unlike river raids where retreat was assured, Mediterranean strikes left them dangerously exposed. Without their network of hidden coves, the raiders found themselves hunted by Moorish warships and Frankish cavalry alike. Their escape, a harrowing overland march to the Rhone, became a cautionary tale. Even the most brilliant tactics had limits when geography turned traitor. Béziers' sack marked both the apex of Norse audacity, and the moment they learned the Mediterranean's golden coasts came at a price even they couldn't plunder forever. The stone arches of Nîmes amphitheater had echoed with cheers for gladiators long dead until the summer of 859, when new voices filled its corridors. Viking raiders, fresh from ravaging southern Francia, didn't just sack this coastal city, they turned its Roman crown jewel into a fortress. Those same passageways once used to parade lions and champions now funneled Norse warriors into defensive positions, their axes glinting where spectators had tossed flowers centuries before. It was more than irony, it was a masterclass in tactical recycling, proving the Vikings could weaponize even the ruins of empires past. Nîmes' fate hinged on its geography. Unlike coastal towns, it sat just far enough inland to feel safe, connected to the Mediterranean by a winding river perfect for Viking ships. When the raiders arrived, they didn't burn the amphitheater's massive stone tiers, they fortified them. Archers perched atop the highest rows, raining arrows down on anyone approaching the gates. The underground chambers, designed to cage beasts, now held Frankish prisoners. Even the drainage channels became escape routes, allowing scouts to slip in and out unseen. This wasn't just occupation, it was a grim evolution, showing how the Northmen could repurpose any structure to their advantage. But the real shock wasn't their ingenuity, it was their endurance. While other raids lasted days, the Vikings held Nîmes for months, turning it into a hub for strikes deeper into Aquitaine. Local nobles, paralyzed by infighting, failed to organize a counterattack until the invaders had bled the region dry. By then, the amphitheater's walls bore new carvings, Norse runes overlapping Latin inscriptions, a visual metaphor for the age itself. The message was clear: history's monuments belonged to those bold enough to claim them. The aftermath lingered like salt in a wound. Long after the Vikings sailed away, Nîmes people avoided the amphitheater, whispering that its shadows still echoed with foreign voices. The city rebuilt, but with a newfound wariness of the waterways that had brought both trade and ruin. Watchtowers sprouted along the riverbanks, their fires kept burning even in peacetime. And the amphitheater, its gates stayed barred for generations, a relic twice cursed, first by Rome's fall, then by the Northmen's triumph. Yet Nîmes' deepest lesson lay in its silence. Unlike other sacked cities, its chroniclers left few accounts of the occupation. No tales of heroic last stands, no miracles shielding the faithful, just gaps in the record as if the trauma defied words. That absence speaks volumes. Sometimes the most devastating raids aren't the ones shouted about in chronicles, but the ones that leave a people too shaken to remember and too scarred to forget. The chapel bells of saints had just begun their evening call to vespers when the first screams shattered the stillness. By nightfall, the abbey's once peaceful cloisters ran red with the blood of monks who dared to face their attackers not with swords but with hymns. The year was 863, and this wasn't just another raid. It was a massacre so vicious, even Norse sagas would later describe it with unease. What turned these waterside sanctuaries into slaughterhouses? The answer might lie not in Viking cruelty alone, but in a betrayal that twisted plunder into vengeance. Saints had been a beacon of learning, its scriptorium famed for illuminated manuscripts that glowed like captured sunlight. But its true vulnerability lay in the treaties signed and broken by local lords. Months before the attack, Frankish nobles had promised silver in exchange for peace, only to renege when Viking bands dispersed. The retaliation was calculated. While most monasteries suffered looting, saints endured something far darker. Chroniclers describe warriors pausing mid-raid to listen as monks choked out psalms through slit throats, their voices fading like echoes in a well. This wasn't random violence, it was a message carved in flesh across the Northmen, and no sanctuary would remain sacred. The raid's aftermath exposed rifts among the raiders themselves. Some commanders reportedly punished their own men for the excesses, fearing such desecration would unite Frankish forces against them. One saga even tells of a Norse elder striking down a younger warrior for tossing relics into the Charente River, snarling that gods, old or new, deserved respect. These internal conflicts reveal an uncomfortable truth. Viking bands weren't monolithic hordes, but volatile coalitions where discipline could shatter over a single act of sacrilege. Yet the deepest wound wasn't the burning library or the shattered altars, it was the broken trust. Saints had opened its gates to Norse traders in the months before the attack, its monks bartering food for amber and furs. That memory lingered like a poison, turning future negotiations into armed standoffs. Frankish lords learned that day that Viking patience had limits, and when pushed too far, their retribution would make even the holiest ground run red. By dawn, the river carried more than smoke downstream. It carried the last fragments of an unspoken pact between raider and ruler, one that would take generations to mend. Perigue's towering Roman walls had stood for 8 centuries, their weathered stones a silent testament to an empire long gone. By the year 848, the locals had grown complacent, trusting those ancient barriers to shield them as they always had. But the Vikings who arrived that fateful summer weren't the same raiders who'd contented themselves with coastal villages. These were warriors who'd studied Frankish defenses and brought back lessons in blood and fire. The siege began with a sound no one expected, the groan of wooden timbers and the creak of ropes under tension. Viking sappers had constructed siege engines crude but effective, using knowledge likely gleaned from captured Frankish engineers. Rocks and flaming debris arched over Perigue's walls, smashing into rooftops and sending panicked citizens scrambling. For the first time, the Northmen weren't just exploiting weak gates or distracted guards. They were dismantling a fortified city piece by piece, turning Roman ingenuity against its descendants. Inside the walls, chaos reigned. The attackers didn't just loot, they methodically erased Perigue's identity. The great Basilica of Saint Front, a pilgrimage site for generations, became a pyre so immense its glow could be seen from miles away. Frankish chroniclers later wrote of the city's libraries burning so fiercely that the heat cracked marble statues, a detail that speaks volumes. This wasn't merely destruction, it was cultural extermination, a deliberate severing of the past from the present. But the raid's true devastation unfolded in the decades that followed. Perigue's surrounding farmlands, once among the most fertile in Aquitaine, lay abandoned. Without the city's markets and protection, villages emptied, their residents fleeing to fortified towns or forests. The region became a cautionary tale. A single Viking victory could unravel an entire web of civilization, leaving behind silence where there had once been bustling trade routes and thriving vineyards. The Frankish response, however, marked a turning point. Kings who'd once relied on wooden palisades and bribes now poured silver into stone fortifications. Masons became as valued as knights, their new walls rising thicker and taller than Roman relics. Perigue's fall proved that against an enemy who could adapt, tradition was no defense. And for the Vikings, their greatest triumph also planted the seeds of their decline. As Frankish strongholds grew stronger, the age of easy plunder faded, forcing the Northmen to choose between becoming settlers or facing castles designed specifically to stop them. In the end, Perigue's ashes taught both sides the same brutal lesson. In war, the victors aren't those who cling to old ways, but those who learn fastest from defeat. The city's ruins stood not just as a grave for the past, but as the foundation of a new era, one where survival meant building not just walls, but wisdom. From Nantes to Perigueux, these 20 forgotten raids paint a portrait of Vikings unlike anything found in storybooks. They weren't just raiders, they were revolutionaries in wolf pelts, men who studied maps as intently as they swung axes. Every attack we've explored reveals a pattern. The Norse didn't just stumble upon wealth, they dissected Europe's political fractures, religious tensions, and geographic blind spots with the precision of surgeons. When rivers became highways and feuding lords left bridges unguarded, the Vikings didn't see chaos. They saw opportunity carved in silver and stone. Consider the aftermath. Each raid sent shockwaves far beyond the smoldering ruins. Kings who once bickered over vineyard borders now raced to fortify rivers with chain barriers and tower garrisons. Monks who'd spent centuries copying scripture began sketching siege engines in the margins of their prayer books. Even the humble fishing village learned to build its church on a hill, not the waterfront. The Vikings unintentionally became Europe's most brutal teachers, forcing kingdoms to innovate or perish. Yet their darkest legacy wasn't the burned cities, but the shadows they cast on the medieval mind. Long after the longships vanished, parents in coastal towns still hushed children with tales of dragon-proud ghosts in the mist. But here's the twist: fear wasn't the only inheritance. Alongside the scars came strange new threads in Europe's cultural tapestry. Norse words seeped into local dialects, from ransack to knife. Trade routes once severed by fear now pulsed with amber, ivory, and ideas flowing both ways. Even the humble barrel, a Viking innovation, revolutionized how goods were stored and shipped. The raids we've uncovered today prove history's greatest paradox: destruction often plants the seeds of rebirth. Vikings toppled walls, yes, but they also toppled complacency. Their axes didn't just hack at gates, they hacked at the old ways, leaving cracks where light could get in. And if that light reveals anything, it's this: the past isn't a ledger of victors and victims, but a forge where even the cruelest hammers can shape unexpected futures. Hungry for more stories where history's hidden blades glint just beneath the surface? Don't just watch, dig deeper. Subscribe and ring that bell, because the next chapter we uncover might just rewrite everything you thought you knew. After all, the darkest corners of history aren't just where empires fall, they're where legends